This time on One Foot Flipper, we'll take a look back at the good old days. Stay tuned.
One foot flipper.
Hi, Paige here, the One Foot Flipper. How's it going, everybody? I'm okay. Sales, not great. Actually deep in the toilet. 100% my fault. You see, you have to list things to sell things. You have to list things in order to sell things, and I keep being unmotivated to go down into my cold basement and list anything. So, my fault. Hey, at least spring break is here though, so I have more of an ability to get work done because Julie is at school, finally back to school, so that's a plus. But that does actually require me to get out of bed in the morning, and I'm going to admit that's hard for me. I have sleep issues, and my wife, she doesn't need nearly as much sleep as I do. So getting up when she gets up at 5 in the morning is absolutely out of the question. I've only been asleep for 4 hours at that point. Sorry, I've only been in bed for 4 hours at that point, of which maybe I slept half of that. Really makes me think back to the good old days, a few years ago, before I started my channel, where I was managing to find size loads of tabletop gaming merchandise about once every 6 months. Just endless merch, all in my category, and the money just never seemed to slow down. It just kept coming in. Those were the good old days. How's that for pronunciation? Thous. Nostalgia. Now, in thinking about nostalgia, I of course need to think about how nostalgia has a huge effect on the reseller market. Particularly, on the kind of things that garage sale pickers, in general, YouTube resellers in specific tend to favor. Your 80s stuff, your toys, your viewer sale items, those sort of things. And a lot of what is sold on eBay is driven by nostalgia. Most people aren't buying those vintage toys to play with. And I know I didn't personally just recently acquire a computer for 1985 in order to keep a sales database. No, I wanted that computer because I wanted one ever since I knew computers were a thing. It's nostalgia. In my case, it's nostalgia for something I never even had. However, not everything from an era is going to create or evoke the same level of nostalgia. And some eras are going to evoke more nostalgia than others. And sometimes the entire nostalgia itself is manufactured. I'll get a little more on that later. And hey, things can be extremely popular in an era and yet not age well or survive so well that they have little to no value later on. Think about Beanie Babies, VHS tapes. Oh, aside from your sealed VHS tapes, of course, that people strangely collect, or your VHS tapes of things that never got released on another format. And actually, for that matter, every obsolete format, laser discs, basically actually every movie format at this point, I believe, is basically obsolete. We are firmly in a digital future, even if many people don't want to believe it. And, basically all your sports cards from the 80s forwards, nearly every sports video game ever made, very little demand for any of that stuff. And you can't even be safe with toys. Sure, Barbie can be great, but the higher-end Barbies that people would actually keep in the box, like Holiday Barbie, Millennium Princess Barbie, Princess Diana Barbie, if that exists, those are going to be much more worse than just something like Surf and Fun Skipper that would have been given to an 8-year-old girl who would have ripped the box open immediately and actually played with it. What does tend to do very well, though, in the nostalgia department are the kinds of toys that had their own television show. He-Man, the Transformers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Did Star Wars have its own show? Somebody post that down in the comments. And then there's others that had their own shows, but I don't think anybody wanted the toys, like Captain Planet. Did anybody want a Captain Planet toy? I didn't. Although I might have also been too old for that by the time that came out. Not really sure. Other things that do well from nostalgia in general, any t-shirts that obviously come from a different era, and any clothing in a style that a hipster might actually wear. And so, different decades are going to evoke more nostalgia than others. For the longest time, the 1950s was the king decade for nostalgia. People misremembering or fantasizing the wonders of that bright, clean, and shiny crime-free America the kind of America where you could leave your doors unlocked, where every car was a work of art that was easily afforded without payments by any family, and gas was almost free. You know, the nostalgia was so big for the 1950s that many popular TV shows and movies from the 1980s were set in the 1950s. In fact, part of 1980s nostalgia is that the 80s were nostalgic for the 50s. But hey, remember how I said misremembering earlier? That's because 1950s nostalgia is largely based on the idealized view of a middle to really upper middle class suburb. America still had poor people, still had dirty places, plenty of crime. In fact, while the 1950s did have a lower overall crime rate than it is today, it is not lower by outrageous numbers, particularly since certain types of crime in modern times are far more likely to be reported than they were in the 1950s. And that cheap gas that everybody talks about in almost every past era, it only seemed cheap because the numbers were smaller. If you actually inflation adjust the fuel prices of the 1950s to where they are in the Midwest today, it's almost nearly identical. Except for the fact that the vehicles in the 1950s used 2 to 4 times as much gas to go anywhere than today's cars did. Now, these days, those who grew up in the 1950s, they are in their mid-70s, and they are more likely to be unloading a lifetime worth of things than they are to be collecting them. And we also have multiple decades of manufactured 1950s nostalgia floating around, you know, signs that people put on the walls, big die-cast models of 1950s cars, all of that kind of stuff. So, 50s, I guess, kind of on the way out. These days, your top finds in 1950s nostalgia are largely going to be clothing, denim especially being huge, both the jackets and the jeans, and leather jackets and other jackets kind of round out the list. That's your best, tends to be your best 1950s stuff, as well as small pieces of furniture, which is more along the lines of a local pickup type of item than something you'd ship. And 1950s media, for the most part, worthless. 50s records have very little value. And there was no 50s movie format. Well, I'm sure there was. Somehow the TV station played it, but that's not anything that you're going to run across at a garage sale. Now, the 1960s is a strange era for nostalgia, because the first half of the 1960s, culturally and style, it really just kind of still belonged to the 1950s. It looked the same. The cars looked the same. The fashions looked the same. It was just mostly the same. Now, the second half of the decade is what we broadly tend to misremember now as the 1960s. And by misremember, I mean mostly that it paints the counterculture of the late 60s as the mainstream, and it portrays that counterculture as just a bunch of tie-dye wearing hippies. Now, in reality, the counterculture was vast and went over all sorts of different types of people, and tie-dye wasn't actually the predominant fashion or even all that huge at the time. It was when it first started to come onto the scene, but if you go look at pictures from Woodstock and other gatherings of 1960s hippies and whatnot, you're not going to see much tie-dye. What you're actually going to see is a lot of flowery and flowing clothes, vaguely Asian or Native American inspired. You'll see a lot more of that than you will of tie-dye. It's just that over time, tie-dye came to represent that era because anybody can make a tie-dye shirt at home, while other outfits are much harder to put together. Your biggest 1960s bolos are going to be in the category of music, musical instruments in particular, although record albums and stereo equipment can also be good, as well as watches. 1960s seems to be the first era where just incredibly valuable watches exist. Small pieces of furniture, once again, like the 1950s, and of course, toys. Now, moving along, I've always thought of the 1970s as just sort of the hanging out era, you know, take it easy, go to Sweet Home Alabama, all those things. You're just kind of hanging out, having a good time. Maybe you're a smoker, a joker, a midnight toker, one of those sort of things. And sort of an extension of the late 60s, but the complaining and being unhappy about the situation seems to have faded away. And the bolos of the 70s are nearly identical to the ones of the 60s. The musical instruments are not as desirable. Watches, however, even bigger than the 60s. And toys and early electronics and computers are starting to come onto the scene. And you do have early video games, but the 70s video games overall are not as desirable as the 80s ones, just because they looked terrible and not many people collect the Atari 2600. All right, on to the 80s. The 80s is the old 1950s. That safe, shiny past with a future so bright that you've got to wear shades. Of course, we've largely forgotten the looming threat of nuclear destruction that we all lived with in the 80s, and not understanding AIDS yet. And don't forget that the crime rate in this safe era was much, much, much higher than it was today. If you go look at a chart, the 80s had so much. The 80s and 90s had so much higher crime than today that it's not even funny. All right, now your 80s bolos are going to be exactly what you thought they'd be: toys, t-shirts, video games, computers, records, and electronics. Now, I've noticed with 80s records, the titles from bands that broke out during the 80s tend to be much more valuable than ones from acts that carried forward from previous decades. You know, I can't think of any bands from the 80s. What am I doing? That Run DMC album is probably going to be better than that Fleetwood Mac album is going to be as far as your 80s records go. Oh, and in the 80s stuff, if you have the ability to move them, the space to store them in, then you'll want to add arcade games to this list. The 80s ones are the preferred ones. They don't crop up cheap as often as they used to, but they're still out there. You could still run across an arcade game with a $100 price tag on it at a garage sale, and it doesn't matter if they work or not, they're still sellable. And if you actually recognize the name, much better. Like everything in video games, though, sports arcade games are the least desirable, with few exceptions. I think NBA Jam is one of the few. All right, let's move on to when I grew up, or at least when I spent my teen years, the 1990s. Remember the 90s? Everything was so extreme and radical. All the music was angsty. Every musician was unhappy and raging against their machines and hating their parents. And now, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I mean, you saw the musicians in their videos, they got all the ladies or all the dudes or whatever they wanted, but not during the 90s. During the 90s, you look at the guys' music videos, the girls wouldn't talk to them, whatever else, unless they were R&B. And because R&B is eternal, it's always the same. Those guys are always smooth. The ladies always love them. They always love the ladies. R&B from the 90s, as far as I'm concerned, exactly the same as every other era, but everything else was just icky and angsty. Even the rap guys who, back in the 80s, rap music was more about hanging out and just being cool. Nope, then in the 90s, they had to start being mad and playing that they were all small-time drug dealers, instead of being cool and hanging out like they used to in the 80s. And then Eminem came along and did the whole alt-rock angst unhappiness thing, but he did it as rap instead and was very successful at it, so I'm not going to have a problem with that. Boy, I've gone off on a tangent here, haven't I? So, angsty music. Eventually in the 90s, we got the internet. This can be the last decade, I think, that has any real nostalgia buys in it. Although early 2000s era toys, specifically anime-related ones, are starting to make some moves in prices. Your video games and t-shirts are going to be some of your number one nostalgia buys from the 90s. But toys, not as much as you would expect. Action figure collecting by adults had really taken off by this point, and there are so many common ones that are still in the original boxes that it's unboxed and loose 90s toys just not as desirable as they were from eras in which you're just unlikely to find them in the box.
We'll return after these messages.
Batteries not included.
Hi,
name is Teddy Ruxpin. Can you and I be friends? I really...
Everybody out!
Then, one day, we found an old treasure map. That's right.
Teddy Ruxpin comes with illustrated book and cassette from Worlds of Wonder.
The sun is getting hotter. Oh, look, is that some water? What's this crazy thingamajiggle? It's a squiggly water wiggle. What you do when you're a giggle?
Water wiggle!
Crazy water wiggle. You can't tell what he'll do. You think you're chasing him, then boo, he's chasing you. What you do when you're a giggle?
Water wiggle!
There's wet in every wriggle. Water wiggle!
Water Wiggle water toy. Your parents attach it to any garden hose. From Whammo.
Oh, Pac-Man, I'm beat!
And I'm hungry.
Thank goodness for Pac-Man pasta from Chef Boyardee.
Pac-Man pasta? Little spaghetti shaped like us. Delicious.
And because Chef Boyardee's packed with goodness, it's great for when we have to eat and run.
Pac-Man pasta from Chef Boyardee. With meatballs, without meatballs, or chicken flavor.
Thank goodness for Pac-Man pasta. Thank goodness for Chef Boyardee.
Hey, and in all cases of nostalgia, the sales are normally driven by what people liked when they were young. You know, maybe from about age 8 up to the early 20s. So that's why your baby toys, not a lot of nostalgia sales for them. They don't tend to increase in value like action figures or dolls or older children's dolls do. We'll just cut some of that out there. And generally, crazes that hit older people are much less likely to survive in a nostalgic manner, which is why all those Beanie Babies that were purchased by adults, not by children, they're never going to have any value, ever. Because nobody is sitting there thinking about, oh man, remember the good times when I had all those Beanie Babies? Nope, nobody's remember that. Now, people do often have nostalgia for eras they didn't live in at all, or frequently for the era right before their real era would have been. This is called anemoia. It's a rather new word. It was phrased in the 21st century, I think, or the late 20th century. Some author came up with it for a book, and it's fairly widely accepted now. It's in the dictionary and everything like that. But nostalgia for another era is a real thing. Like, I know I personally like 80s music better than 1990s music, even though I was a teenager throughout the 90s. I turned 13 in 1990. But I just love the 80s themes of love and victory over the whining, complaining, and angst of most of the 1990s music. You know, and a lot of people will just have nostalgia for a different era because that era might seem better, or just presented to them as better. I feel like there's a lot of that going on with the 80s right now. 80s nostalgia is being manufactured on its own, constantly referenced everywhere, movies, TV shows. You know, there's a movie my daughter watched a whole bunch of times about somebody getting a Nintendo for Christmas, and she's 11 and she thinks the 80s is cool, and you know, she was born in the 21st century. And if you see anybody my age or older, you know, 47 or so, wearing a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles t-shirt, you can be certain that that's a sign of anemoia. Because those cartoons and toys didn't even come out until we were too old to be interested in them. Now, the Ninja Turtles themselves, they date back to the early 80s, but it was an ultra-violent black and white indie comic book. All the characters had red masks. They did not really have all that distinctive personalities. And most of the villain characters lasted exactly one issue because the Turtles would kill them. In fact, the only licensed product back then for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was the role-playing game here by, what is this by? Palladium Games. Notice how they all have red headbands? They all have red headbands. When I was 10 and 11, this was the coolest thing in the world. This game was. And then, late 1989, the Kitty Turtles hit the radar. It had been reimagined as a cartoon and a toy line aimed at 6-year-olds. That's when the having distinctive personalities and having different color headbands came in. They made a really short cartoon miniseries, and then Over in 1988, a couple things trickled in. They made a separate comic line for the new Kitty Fight Turtles that Archie put out. Then December 88, a full season of the TV show came out, and then 89 is when it just really hit everybody's radar. And at that point, I couldn't be seen carrying this book at school because everybody would think I was some sort of weirdo who was into a 6-year-old's cartoon. So no way I'm going to get to play the game. Couldn't even carry the cool comic around either way. People would think the same thing because before they'd never heard of it. So yeah, my personal nostalgia for the Turtles is that the Turtles that everybody else remembers fondly ruined the ones that I remember. Oh boy, that went off on a tangent. And then what can also happen, the person's involved in a hobby that has a golden age period of time. And over time, people pursuing that hobby will start to shift their preferences to the golden age of that collecting time, or the hobby time. Probably no hobby this is more seen in than video game collecting. Like, the guys who collect the big arcade games like I used to, doesn't matter how old they are, they're almost universally going to cultivate a game room of games produced between 1979 and 1983, as that was the arcade golden age. I've owned hundreds of arcade games in my life. At one point, I had a rotating collection of 20 plus games in my basement at all times, and I never had more than 2 or 3 at a time that were newer than 1983, despite the fact that my prime arcade playing years were 89 to 96. The hobby preferred that earlier era of games, which caused me to, over time, prefer that earlier area of games. And video game console collectors, they do the exact same thing. They'll start collecting for whatever their teenage console was first, and then they'll start sliding backwards in time until all they're caring about is that 8 and 16-bit era of 1985 to 1995, buying nothing but their Sega Genesis and Nintendo cartridges. And you know how you know this is true? Go look at any retro game channel on YouTube. You will probably have to look at 10 of them to find a host of one of those channels that's actually old enough to have lived through that era. All those 30-year-olds hosting their retro gaming channels where they do nothing but talk about Nintendo games from 1987, most of those guys' first console was a PS3. Not a NES. So just like times change with what's fashionable and what people want to purchase or they want to own, times are going to change in the reselling world as well. And you can't let nostalgia rule how you're operating your business. I don't care if just guessing the prices of all your books and records and putting them all up used to work for you for 15 years and it doesn't work anymore. You can sit there and keep trying to do it that way because, oh boy, that's how it worked in the good old days. Or you could leave the good old days in the past where they used to be and move along with your life. Everybody remembers the good old days of the 90s on eBay, at least those who were involved, when everything you listed, you had no competition really in anything. Everything you'd list would sell. You seemingly get good prices. Nobody was paying taxes. Taxes? What are taxes? eBay fees were barely existed. Yada, and just everything was so great. What they don't remember is buying the postage at the counter at the post office and how the post office would hate you and would make up rules as to how many things you were supposedly allowed to ship per day, or endorsing all of those checks and money orders on a constant basis to put in the bank account, or how every third person just didn't pay and it was a bigger deal back then than it is now because you didn't know they didn't pay for weeks. Not all times in the past are the good times. I might have had better sales a few years ago, but I could just sit there and think back about those good times, or I could actually work towards making the times that I have right now be the good times, which is what I suggest you do. Alright, I think I have rambled on long enough. Hey, remember the good old days when I didn't talk so much? If you remember any friends from your good old days, tell them about this channel. I could use the subs as I still haven't caught Old School Picker and subscribers. Hey, remember the good old days when Old School Picker made videos?